Morning, colleagues. The NGO Forum to speak about reimagining civil society's role in Uganda's democratic future between political realities and aspirational governance. And there were a number of things I was asked to do. Maybe let me just start by a very slight definition. There are quite a number of civil society, but I'll adopt that of Britannica, which sees it as a dense network of groups, communities, networks, and ties that stand between the individual and the modern state. And I think that's quite important because it sort of puts, it says there's this thing called the state and suggests that there's something to be feared from the state. Now, the political scientists here will recall the classic compact, the idea that there's a contract between individuals and the state, that there was an initial moment where there was in the state of nature, the state that pre-exists the state, human beings are free. Man is born free, and everywhere is in chains. But the ideally that you're born free. But the very idea of freedom itself becomes a risk to freedom. That if everyone can do what they want, no one is safe. And that therefore you have a small giving up of liberty to secure the rest of liberty. That's the deal, that's the idea behind the social contract. So the state is created for a very specific purpose, which is to secure liberty. And this is critical because among the values I saw that CSO should commit to going forward, I saw integrity, etc. I didn't see a commitment to freedom. And I suspect this might be the most important value. A strongly held core belief in the importance of human beings to be free. Within, of course, acceptable limits. Those envisaged in Article 43 of our Constitution, the rights and freedoms of others, is a very clear one. But that really, ideally, the default, our default state is one of freedom. And that the state is specifically created to safeguard that freedom. So civil society stands somewhere in the middle of that space between the vulnerable individual and the state. A state which, of course, over the years has become more and more, has claimed for itself more and more power. But then this takes us to a very interesting year, 1648, and the Treaty of Westphalia, in which the idea was that the various ways in which individuals associate and express certain beliefs, values, in which they relate, whether through faith or religion or familiar ties or kinship, Nkwasiba and your friend, Chris Nkwasiba and your friend. The year 1648 is important because the state is created as, and it's going forward, you have to articulate and negotiate within the idea of that particular state. So that while at one point you might say, I'm a Mchiga, I'm a Mnyankore, I'm a Muganda, I'm a Choli. Well, ideally, everyone should have their state, but practically, you negotiate within the state. So perhaps ideally, the state should be composed of people who share a story, a common story that binds them. But of course, our experience in Uganda and in many other states created out of the colonial moment is one where you have a state that was crafted out of expediency. We shall not belabor the point about the extractive nature of the state and how a political society was crafted around a very specific idea. But just to mention the year, 1889, the Battle of Mengo, in which through force of arms, the Maxim gun, you have a hierarchy of religious, basically a hierarchy of religions in Uganda established, not written, but clear. Protestants at the top, Catholics number 2, Muslims number 3, and others. And that then, of course, is the basis on which we have the Declaration of the Protectorate in 1894. And eventually then, the agreements that formalized colonial rule. I tell this story because that beginning of the state that we have and the contestations that were frozen at that particular time, the subnational groups, many of which were actually states. So there's that famous song in Maria, how do you solve a problem like Maria? How do you solve a problem, in quotation marks, like Buganda, a 500-year-old state in Uganda, or for that matter, any other of the subnational groups that are forever, again in quotation marks, apparently, trapped within the Ugandan state? Or questions around religion and religious identity that remain critical, all of which have been reflected in more ways than one in all the foundational documents we've had from the creation of the state. Sometimes they are explicit, other times they are implicit. So in the 1900 agreement, you have land allocated, parceled out, including to churches, specifically, a number of square miles to this church, some land to the Mbogo chief, Mbogo the Mohammedan chief. Clear demarcation based on subnational identity. Now, evidently, therefore, there's a certain tension there at the beginning of our founding. Our birth certificate as Uganda, if you go to report a case, you have to, for some reason, also indicate your ethnicity. I don't know why that is important. But the birth certificate of Uganda has etched into it these features. Some call them questions. So you have a king, Mwanga, who has been exiled, where the experiment in Christianizing him had failed. I think the idea had been to call him Danieli. So Daniel is in exile, and you have Daudi Chua, on whose behalf certain commitments are made. In fact, the very state itself in 1894, the very declaration was procured by an evangelical mission, Bishop Tucker, who went to the United Kingdom and begged and made the case for Uganda that if you invest enough, if as the state, the British state, you have the military, etc., you can do what the company failed to do. And from then on is an entire timeline of this tension in which the state, Chris talks about, and the entire theme of the convention is politics, money, and that is right at the start of Uganda, but there's of course another M that is missing in that formulation. I see someone, I think, sharing. I'm tempted to ask, To ask what is the missing M, okay, I'll let you be. But let me perhaps ask, what is the missing M? We've talked about money, there's politics. What is the other M that is missing in any discussion of Uganda's governance? Which one? By anyone, there are some wrong answers, and I'll tell you when there are wrong answers, but shall be kind about it. Chris, we're talking about money, politics, but there's a certain M that cannot be missed. Which one? Anyone? There's an M. There's a certain thing that starts with M. Yes, Malcolm. Because the very foundation of our state, the battle of Mengo, the very battle, the one that decides the fate, establishes the hierarchies, also establishes the partnership that Buganda will play in the subjugation of other subnational groups. So in discussing civil society, a history of those manifestations is necessarily a history also of the military, a history of how the military was used to establish a political structure, and how through that military and political structure, money was extracted from the communities now called Uganda. Right from the agreement of 00, from the hard tax, the land tax, to the orders in council, 1902, native authority agreements, everything else. But something else is happening at that moment. There's a change being forced on the individual. He's being required, he and she are being required to go through a process of, you had to go through a process of, cleansing, maybe is the best way to describe it. To take part in the new state that was being crafted from 1894 going forward, you had in some ways to denounce your former self. Denounce the forms of education you had before. Denounce your very names. I've already referenced Daniel and Daudi. Denounce your religion. And incidentally, the one religion that was criminalized by the colonial state as quote-unquote witchcraft in 1906 in the Witchcraft Ordinance was that one religion that dared be used, that dared challenge authority. So from that moment onwards, you have a confluence of things, and it's apparent from the case law of the time. Case law, part of which we are going to see echoes of today. I'll just give one example, Rex versus Amkeo, that famous case that declared polygamy to be problematic, and actually basically said it was dismissed it as wife purchase, etc. The language inside there is a language of money. The judge says the lady was not a free contracting agent. That's the language of the market. The idea was to create in the native a subject who could move on their own, operate in the state on their own, pay taxes as an individual, and that will replicate in other cases, Goabin, Kilimo. The idea that we want to see you as an individual, participating in the market, forced on you, paying taxes, but detached in some ways from the community. So when independence reaches, the question was, will this state change? Was that state going to be transformed? And strangely, or perhaps predictably, throughout the wave of decolonization, the agreement was uti possidetis. Let the borders stand. It was perhaps practical. Renegotiating. Buganda had tried to leave in 1960 with the Luchiko Memorandum, but again, by force of arms, it was kept within Uganda. We know the attempt in 1966 and the trauma from that period. We know 71 to 79. We know our history. Let's just fast forward to 1995 in the next 20 minutes that I have. Because actually, let's start at 1986. Because there you have, because that's the current state that we have. You have a group that were masters of violence, masters of sophisticated violence. Because of course Idi Amin was a soldier, and there had been soldiers before. But in the NRM/A, you had a group that had actually best approximated the use of violence in the colonial period, because the colonial violence was not just brutal, and actually could not just be brutal because there were not enough officers on the ground in any case. I think at the highest, there might have been not about 5,000 or 8,000, I need to check. 8,000 people for a local population in the millions. It was impracticable to use force alone to either establish or maintain colonial rule. So a lot of it was again maintained through the means we have described. Religion. There's an interesting book by Teverondwa, Missionary Teachers as Agents of Colonialism. That was a very, very important mechanism. It's not just here but elsewhere, even in slaves obey your masters. What better mechanisms? It's right there, it's in the book. All authority comes from God. There's just so many ways in which religion was a very important means of maintaining what could not merely be maintained by force. Education also. Law also, because it has that legitimizing idea around it. Money also, because what was the 1900 agreement if not a land grab? And I think Kalundi Serumaga makes the point, and I think even his Twitter handle is still native land grab, I think. What was the 1900 agreement if not one of the biggest heists in Uganda's history? So Museveni and his team were successful and have been successful to date because they added ideology to the gun and mastered the ways in which to alternate between actual force, in which you see people being shot, as happened in Kasese and in the last election, and then processes of constitution making and parliaments and courts and NGOs and civil society conventions and NGO bureaus and human rights commissions, balancing brute force where necessary and things that make us feel safe, happy, contented. So there was a very easy alliance in 1986 between the state and good NGOs that did not challenge the state. Uganda Women's effort to save orphans. Who can argue against that? Well, and of course, that was actually started by the First Lady, isn't it? And quite a number of other, quote-unquote, developmental NGOs, the good NGOs, assisting the state, assisting the government to do in places where, for a whole range of reasons, there was no capacity. So you have those good NGOs working side by side with other mechanisms. Parliament is there, and again, Kalundi, we have to quote from Kalundi who says, and I credit Yusuf Serunkuma for bringing this to my attention on Twitter yesterday. So there had been complaints that there's a lot of bribery in Parliament. And Kalundi made the point that, no, that's not the problem. Parliament was the bribe. Parliament was the bribe. Which is that the Constitution of 1995, itself a document that was a way, again, consistent with people are waiting for a transition, they are getting anxious, give them a long, drawn-out constitution-making process. Make it as elaborate as possible, but of course ensure that within it, only one correct answer will emerge, one correct solution. Ensure that there's no serious discussion about the subnational contestations, the networks, remember the definition, the dense networks of groups, individuals, communities that make up Uganda. Ensure that they don't actually have a real discussion about the nature of the state. Ensure that the answer that you want comes out. Ensure that the movement system is going to be enshrined in the document at the famous Article 269, etc., etc., etc. And in that same document, recognize the good NGOs. And so the national objectives are full of recognition of the role of NGOs in supporting the state in terms of education, health, etc., etc. Give a little room for civic organizations. In Article 38, talk about the right to civic participation through either individually or organizations. Give some room in Article 29 for expression and association. Talk about popularizing the Constitution in Article 4. Make some concessions, certainly. But of course, and again, so you make some concessions, but you postpone the real discussion. You postpone the real discussion that we've never had as Ugandans, never quite had, about the nature of the state. Never. In the run-up to independence, the discussion was in Marlborough and Lancaster. A few groups taken there who suffered in winter, were anxious to come back home, and were in any case, 66, 71, 79, all of these problematic, traumatic experiences. And then the fuss of 1988 to 1995 that has that document then that is described, in which Parliament was a bribe, and the bribes keep happening. The size has kept expanding to accommodate a whole range of people who shout. Districts continue being chopped up, again to accommodate new claims, but no real space for a discussion around how the people of Uganda would like to be governed, including, of course, the mess that would come from that, including the question around the old questions, the place of Uganda, the northern question, the land question, etc. So we've kicked the can down the road for a long time. So freedom remains. So there are people who are talking about, I think, empty the jails, about how full the prisons are, and of course they are. But we are in one large prison, all of us walking around in this huge, huge prison in which we're let out temporarily to breathe. But any of you watch The Truman Show? This gentleman who lived his life until he realized that what he thought was his life was in fact a reality show. But his neighbors, etc., were all parts of we're living The Truman Show, in which the producer is Museveni and company. So you're allowed to be as long as you're good. Just like it had been in the colonial period, you were allowed to survive as long as you were. There was an actual ordinance, the Removal of Undesirable Natives Ordinance, 1908. You, you, you could move, live, and breathe as long as you remained a desirable native. Who was a desirable native? Someone who paid their taxes, worked hard, performed forced labor once in a while, and didn't complain. So we're allowed to move around, make speeches like this, go back home, as long as whenever your phone is tapped, no, the keywords are missing. The keywords, I imagine, what, bomb? I don't know what else would be the keyword that would finally let you become a guest of the state. And that, of course, is a very smart approach, to have a Truman Show like, and civil society, good ones, good NGOs, good judges, good members of parliament, good elections, a good electoral commission, etc. And one of the ways the Truman Show continues to happen is the mind. Is the mind. Religion did a number on us, a terrible one. It continues to do a very significant number on us. The very same justifications. All power comes from all power comes from the Lord. If the Lord did not want him to be president, he would not be. A failure to recognize that the struggles of others are a joint struggle, and I'll explain this shortly. Can we have the free and democratic society contemplated in Article 43 without a pedagogy that is steeped in emancipation? I don't think so. Right from primary school, the method of instruction is through canes. And our teachers proudly told us the African child's what? Ears are where? In the buttocks, without any sense of irony whatsoever. So you're traumatized in primary school, traumatized in secondary school, and also, I must admit, traumatized at university. The lecturers also are traumatized. I won't say very much. But there's a whole range of ways in which we accept limitation. And worse, we reproduce it, reinforce it, we justify it. There's a reason why the secondary school, the missionary schools were established way before, and only reluctantly, Makerere as a vocational school in 1922. And the reason why legal education was never provided in the colonial state, never. So the first locally trained lawyers were produced in terms of studying here. That only happened after 1962. And I suspect there's a reason why a real liberal arts education is still denied to many people. But what that does is that then you have it was Immanuel Kant who said, dare to think. But how can you dare to think if in primary school there was a list of talkatives? A list of those who were talking when the teacher was outside the class. It was a dreaded list. To be on the list of those who were talking. So how then can you demand active citizens who have been channeled through a funnel of subservience? My daughter was in a traditional school, one which my mother attended. And I made the choice to remove all of them and take them elsewhere, when on one of the visiting days, a teacher assured me, your daughter is doing well, but she has one problem. She's too expressive. But don't worry. Don't worry, we shall work on it. Don't worry, we shall work on that. She expresses herself, but don't worry. That's the challenge, that's her problem, but don't worry. Give us about 2 or 3 terms, and we shall have worked on it. I feared what was going to be done to this young Muchiga girl. So I took her somewhere else where, anyway. But the link, that link is missing. And that's why the Constitutional Court of Uganda could, without irony, in the Fox Odoi case, say that yes, there's academic freedom within limits, within the limits of your expertise. So, yes, you can be an academic, but if you were hired as a lawyer, perhaps you shouldn't be talking about political science. What kind of freedom is that? Also, geographical. Once you leave the university, once you leave the gates of the university, then and the idea was because you might have ideas that cause disquiet. And many Ugandans cheered that decision without reading the text. The idea was, yes, those bad people, without any irony. You have the Constitutional Court sanctioning a 4.5-day consultation process. 4.5 days. 4.5 days. That was passed as legitimate. So, Chris, what is the value that civil society in Uganda could have? I think the most important one is a real commitment to freedom, with all the consequences that has, with the mess that brings, with the messy conversations, the negotiations, the difficulties we shall have to have as a group. What do I mean? As we were waiting for the day to start, the very lovely choir began to sing a song that I then recognized as being the song Adam Nekawa. It's a song by Bobby Wine from a number of years ago. And it begins, it says, "So it was written, so it must be done. Omwami afuge, n'omukyala agonde, amaka gasobole okubeerawo. Ekitiibwa ky'omukyala kwe kubeera n'omwami gw'ayagala ate gw'agondera." Okay, I'll translate. But it's steeped in religion. That it was written that the man is the head of the house, and he should head it, and the wife must submit. And that is the basis on which the home will survive. Okay. It was a nice song, nice lyrics, nice beats rather. But just go a little bit into the words and you realize the problem. A problem of a society that has accepted chains, that negotiates for freedom for us, that the NGO Act is problematic and must be liberalized. There are too many restrictions. My license was not given to me. It's been a year now. Allow me to, as an NGO. But surely, in this Uganda here, it's very important that for the stability of the family, there must be a head of the house, and that's also, it's in the homework, isn't it? It's in social studies homework. Who is the head of the house? The only acceptable answer, the father. 2025. So how can you have freedom and democracy that the society envisaged in Article 43 of the Constitution if you have an entire educational system, an entire way of thinking, steeped in religion and culture, etc., that not only tolerates but justifies and reinforces chains for others, women, and a whole range of marginalized groups which civil society has said, those ones, yeah, as we do human rights, but those ones, those ones. But how? Do you not see the embedded, do you not see that that's impossible? A real commitment to freedom. And it's going to be a challenge, of course, because there are new old dangers. Very recently, the Constitutional Court of Uganda held that no-fault divorce is not constitutional. I don't know. But in coming to that decision, the Constitutional Court cited at length the views of a gentleman called Scott Yena, Bradford Wilcox, and a certain group called Holland Family Law. The views of Mr. Yena were given 7 pages out of a decision that was about 50-something pages. Scott Yena. Who is Scott Yena? He's a gentleman who has said, in 2021 at the National Conservative Conference, said that educated women are meddlesome, quarrelsome, are medicated, meddlesome, and quarrelsome. This is a gentleman who conceivably will not appreciate the idea of having female justices of the Constitutional Court. This gentleman who is now being cited, whose ideas and thoughts now form part of the law of our land. On that same question were several voices of Ugandan women, written. Dr. Zahara Nampeo, who I think will be on the panel later on, Dr. Maria Nasali, Dr. Esther Mayambala Kisache, Dr. Monica Twesime Kiria. Not even cited, not even acknowledged. Instead, the views of Christian nationalists being foregrounded, given prominence, to the detriment of the constitutional freedoms in our Constitution. So certainly, we need to recognize and respond to new dangers, new shifts, new threats to freedoms. And I always find that alliance very strange. And maybe when our Ugandans start getting deported, maybe then they'll appreciate, anyway. We are now, if I may just 1 minute, we are now entering, and the confluence of bad actors is clear to see. There are now agreements between our state and other states in which we agree to receive criminals. We have accepted a role as shithole countries. We were called shithole countries in the past, and now we're acquiescing, we're ratifying that description by literally entering into an agreement in which we agree to receive the worst of the worst. At least during colonialism, the so-called undesirable natives were removed from here and taken elsewhere. Now, our role in the global community is to remove the undesirable natives of elsewhere. How low we have sunk. But that agreement comes with, what are we getting out of it? Perhaps the agreement to look away when people are being told to nyankore in the basement. So to recognize that the importance of freeing Uganda here, it's important so that as a minimum we have a place that we can call home for everyone, and in which everyone, without distinction as to race, sex, etc., can be free, without the military men hovering over us. But even if those military men are taken away, without also the songs, Adam and Hawa, and such other men, the head of house, Secondly, of course, the question around internal transitions, and I'm glad it was envisaged there. SEHAD has done something there. Chapter 4, I see Anthony Masaka here, there's been a transition there. On Saturday, we are celebrating the transition at TIRAF. So it's good also. There has to be some element of dynamism and energy within these organizations. How can you promise or aspire to freedom elsewhere if you have the youth in your organization bottled up with no foreseeable transition, no elections even to speak of? We certainly have to reduce personal vulnerabilities, personal and organizational vulnerabilities. This may sound strange, but you're easier to control and easier to shut up if you need money. And at the personal level, your chances of needing money are higher if you have very many children. And very many wives or husbands. Then you almost become a small state. Your school fees bill every term, then you have to be corrupt. So many things happen. Personal vulnerabilities. If, on the other hand, however, you have cut your cloth according to your size, you've been rational, you've been logical, you have not been too greedy, you're more able to withstand threats, either direct or indirect, about your source of income, etc. Or even threats to your personal liberty. But if you're 60, 65, that should be the age when you're happy to go to prison because your kids are old. But now you're 60, you have a baby, then you're also saying, my children are young. I'll not continue on that point. But finally, before Chris comes here and drags me off kicking and screaming, from the Law Society, we have a radical new bar. And the president of that radical new bar is in exile. Which is a very good thing, because it means he did his work well. It means he was a bad ULS president. Bad in quotation marks. We need some, Mamdani once talked about a good Muslim and a bad Muslim, in quotation marks of course, and the idea about how states were forcing, creating this caricature of Islam and terrorizing Muslims within this rubric of good Muslim, bad Muslim. Obote, it's rumored that Obote talked about a good Muganda, etc. Sorry? Yeah, but it's a rumor. We hear talk of the good opposition. Matthias Mpuga perhaps is a good one. I see on the program Norbert Mauer is going to close, might close. He's perhaps good because he's good, isn't it? Eh? The good opposition doesn't even present presidential candidates. They are fine. As DP, personally, I think Museveni should stay, he said. Mpuga also says, personally, I think really, President will leave, we go for parliamentary, good opposition. I suspect there's also good civil society, isn't it? Eh? There must be good civil society. Which one? Yes, so you're mentioning some names, those are yours. But I suspect there's good civil society. Civil society with which the government is very happy. No problem whatsoever. We like you very much, you're good. I suspect we don't need good civil society. But Chris, you guys were very happy yesterday with the NGO Bureau, they were here. There was no contestation. Was there a contestation whatsoever? You are happy. You are happy, everything is fine. They're in the same prison. I said this one time, I'll say it again. I was shocked when on Twitter I saw a member of the Human Rights Commission sharing a joke with the CDF. The CDF, who is on record as live tweeting torture. A good Human Rights Commission. So, yeah, so you're scared of the NGO Bureau? What? Chris, you like them? You're scared of... This is why I'm on this app, to tell the truth and run back to Makerere. Maybe there's need now for bad civil society. A bad civil society that actually stands between the individual and the state. Not a civil society that seems to be too comfortable with the state, too comfortable with negotiating through licensing, begging for existence, accommodating. Yes, Andrew, it had to be Andrew Karamaji, and you can see you're clapping alone because you're the only bad one. And incidentally, the name is here, written in red, Andrew Karamaji. Yes, that is the example of bad civil society. And that is the bad civil society that we need. We need a radical new NGO, a radical new civil society. Andrew, are you still in exile? You come, you go. Yes, that's how it should be. You should be so bad that your continued stay in Uganda, peacefully, unbothered, is untenable. It should be so bad that I think you described, I saw in the program, works with civil society in Zimbabwe, Zambia, and South Africa. Uganda is stopped officially. It should be so bad that that's what happens. If, however, civil society, you are allowed to exist without something has gone wrong. But final answer is, final, and it goes back to the point I made about the state, that beyond the organization, we must remember the groups that were constrained in 1888, 1900 rather. The conversations that simply have not gone away and will not go away. The questions around subnational identities, especially. The enduring civil society of the subnational group. But above all, fellow Ugandans, I invite you to do that which Immanuel Kant, a very long time ago, challenged human beings to do. To dare to think. And in so daring, dare to think about the freedom not just of ourselves, but others, including those whose way of life we might disagree with. Because what is freedom if not for everyone? Thank you very much, Chris. Awesome.